So I sort of quit in burnout, anger, and alcohol dependence in the July 2020. And the very next day, my good friend Chris Davis, whose apartment I'm in at the moment, gave me a call and was like, "Oh, you've quit Deloitte. Would you be interested in helping me set up this Clean Slate Clinic thing? I know you've got some time on your hands now." And I had never addressed my own drinking problem. I knew I had a problem. If you want to make life as hard for yourself as possible, I would recommend be a female founder in the healthcare space, trying to do something in addiction. So people coming in for amputation, avoidable amputations, because of socioeconomic factors, lack of education awareness, smoking, diet, etc. And so I think that sort of passion was ignited there. I was like, we've got to be able to do better than this. Most people, when I said that I had an alcohol problem, were very surprised, had no idea. But it had been developing for many years. We actually need to decriminalise, we need to support people, we need to recognise addiction for what it is, which is a condition that is not the individual's fault, and they need support and help, and to criminalise and penalise and punish does not work. What our service provides is fully home-based, integrated and comprehensive assessment, withdrawal and recovery. And it's a 12-month programme done at home under the supervision of addiction medicine specialists, GPs with enhanced training, and alcohol and other drug experienced nurses. And it's an alternative to inpatient rehab and withdrawal. I think here's a couple of others for you. 80% of our clients have a co-occurring mental health condition, most commonly anxiety, depression, ADHD, PTSD. Some fantastic, some questionable in the evidence base that they're using for their approaches, but completely out of reach for most Australians. But I think those are exactly some of the, if you think about weighing up the pros and cons, the pros of the investment are it gives you the opportunity to compete and to stay at the cutting edge for exactly the reasons you described. Like, if you're at the cutting edge, then you should probably start looking behind you, because you can guarantee you're not going to be there alone for long. Surround yourself with advisors and supporters who can help you, whether they're people that have been there before, been there, done it, or people that have connections that you're looking for. Find the people that are going to help you. Don't try to do it alone.
Just before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, can you please hit subscribe or follow? This helps me tremendously to grow my channel. Welcome, Pia, to the podcast. Great to have you.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
Yeah, I really admire what you're doing, the space that you're in, social enterprise, and particularly in the health sector, which you've got an amazing background in that sector. And you've got your own personal story that we'll get into as well. And you're doing some amazing work helping people with addictions in an area that's very much lacking. And that's, when people want to get help, they need that help straight away. And I've even had, experience in some of my family members, it's not there. And then they're ready, and then you lose that moment and it's disaster. So, love the work that you're doing. So I guess, let's get started. Tell us a bit about your personal journey and how it led you to co-found Clean Slate Clinic.
Sure thing. So I'm a health economist by background. That's my training, and have always worked in healthcare. I'm very, very passionate about healthcare, and particularly the intersection between social justice and healthcare. And I think that probably comes from my very first job in healthcare, which was as a medical secretary in a vascular surgery ward. And you starkly see the social disparities. So people coming in for amputation, avoidable amputations, because of socioeconomic factors, lack of education awareness, smoking, diet, etc. And so I think that sort of passion was ignited there. I was like, we've got to be able to do better than this. Worked in healthcare my whole career, in the public service, in the National Health Service in the UK. You can probably tell I'm a POM from my accent. And then I moved into consulting, health strategy consulting in the UK, and then over here in Australia at Deloitte. And I was the national lead partner for healthcare in Deloitte before Clean Slate Clinic. At the same time, so, very high performing, high functioning, but I had been using alcohol for many, many years. First, probably as, a means of addressing lack of confidence and identity. So I started drinking very young, like 12, 13 years old. Then I used it as a reward system whilst I was in university. It was going out partying and drinking. And then as I got older, it became a crutch for stress and anxiety. And as the stress increased in my working life, so my alcohol use increased as well. So I was, as I said, very high functioning. Most people, when I said that I had an alcohol problem, were very surprised, had no idea, but it had been developing for many years. So I sort of quit in burnout, anger, and alcohol dependence in the July 2020. And the very next day, my good friend Chris Davis, whose apartment I'm in at the moment, gave me a call and was like, "Oh, you've quit Deloitte. Would you be interested in helping me set up this Clean Slate Clinic thing? I know you've got some time on your hands now." And I had never addressed my own drinking problem. I knew I had a problem. I'd done all the Googling. Am I an alcoholic? I'd looked for rehab. I thought my only option was inpatient rehab. And it was just that was too much for me. There was no way that I was going to go to inpatient rehab and take 3 weeks off and tell my family and all that sort of stuff. It just didn't feel like what I wanted or needed. Yeah. So I jumped at the chance because I thought, well, this is very interesting professionally for me because it's right at the intersection between social justice and healthcare. But I also know I have a personal issue that I haven't yet tackled. So got involved, did the service design, which is something that I have done a lot of. So it's really thinking through, how do we take the evidence base around what works in addiction, develop a virtual care model around that, and build and run with that. So did the service design. We spoke to a number of Chris's face-to-face clients to understand what was important from a client's perspective, and then did friends and family testing. And so part of the friends and family testing was you do an assessment to see whether you need to go through the service or not. And if I was the 1 of 10, which is about what the population statistics would say, that actually needed to go through the service proper. So I was actually Clean Slate Clinic's very first client in our very first minimum viable product, went through the service, and having had that life-changing experience, that is, we'd obviously started co-founding this thing, but I guess it was a bit of a hobby at that point. That's what really gave me the passion and drive to say, we've got to do this thing, we've got to grow this thing, and we've got to make this service available for anybody who needs it.
It's pretty amazing. So you were the first person going through, and that's brilliant because talk about being able to provide great feedback from your own experience.
And let me tell you, the technology was terrible in the early days. So it was very, very MVP, but it still worked. I'm 3 and a bit years down the track, and it really worked. So, yeah.
And that's a big lesson in startups as well. Sometimes people, I did in mine, way overdo it with their MVP that it becomes like a giant thing, which ours did. I mean, sometimes you only need that first iteration, and then see if it works, see if we can sell it. In your case, if it works, which it did, and then you can keep developing from there, and then you're getting customer feedback, and you're the customer.
So exactly. I love that phrase. Don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, because I think it's a trap that we can all fall into. And if we'd waited for perfect, and I think it's difficult in healthcare because clearly there's risks that you need to manage. So from a management of risk, clinical safety perspective, kind of perfection is the only option. But from a technology point of view, or your customer pathway point of view, or your marketing materials, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good. Yeah,
exactly. And that journey that you went on starting as a child and all the way through, and then teenager, etc., I'm guessing that would be a very, very familiar journey for many people.
Incredibly common. And there's good evidence that for most people who've turned to alcohol or other substances, you can usually either trace it back to childhood and trauma, big or little t. It doesn't have to be some catastrophic event, but challenges in childhood where you've used alcohol for identity, for social inclusion, for belonging, and then it's continued to be use throughout, or it might be some sort of catastrophic life event later down the track. So, a lot of people during COVID, you see this sort of increase in alcohol as a relief and sort of increasing dependence as a result of that. But yeah, for a very large number of people, heavy drinking in teenage and young adult years, which particularly for our generation was incredibly common, it's kind of then leads to alcohol dependence in later years. Because if you have high and regular consumption, usually there's only one direction that's going in.
Yeah, yeah. And they say the earlier that you start, the more likely you are to be an alcoholic, I think.
That's correct, exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. We are very much an alcohol sort of culture, aren't we? Like, we celebrate with alcohol, we do everything with alcohol. There's alcohol everywhere, really. So if you have a problem with it, it must be very difficult.
It's a bit, yeah, exactly. It's the only highly addictive class 1 carcinogen where it's socially unacceptable not to do it still. So people think if you're not drinking, it means you're an alcoholic or there's something wrong with you. And it's this, alcohol has this weird hold on society, and we can, blame the alcohol industry for that to a large degree. They've been very effective in their marketing, that it's such a strong part, particularly in Australia and the UK. It's such a strong part of cultural identity that you're weird if you don't do it.
It's true. It's sadly true. But at least there's now programs like yours. If people do have a problem, that they can reach out to you, and we'll leave the links to all of that in the show notes for the podcast. So you're saying that quite often it could be, people could, like, we're talking about alcohol, but does this relate to drug addiction as well?
Absolutely.
So, okay. So let's say you talked about childhood trauma. Can you think back to anything that happened when you were a child that might have led to this?
Yeah. So my mum died when I was 5, and my brothers and I discovered her the next day. We were in a hotel room, and we found her the next day. She was on holiday with the children and no one else there. So that was obviously a pivotal moment in my life. And then, and I have a wonderful stepmother who I have a fantastic relationship with. But there were some difficult years after that, and certainly as a young preteen, I struggled. I was a foot taller than all of my friends. I had this sort of lack of identity, this otherness that I think came from having lost my mother, and alcohol, was a great way for me to feel included. So I definitely used it as a crutch from a young age, and drinking was great at that time. You drink, you fit in, you're part of a gang. So it worked. It did what it was intended to do for me at that time, which was to make me feel included and to belong.
And if you don't mind me asking, like, how did your mother die? Like, and how were you, like, in a separate room or something, and you woke up, and, like, tell us what happened there?
Yeah. So she had an asthma attack. So she had asthma. We'd gone on holiday, her and the 4 kids. We were all in the same room. And she'd taken the wrong inhaler with her. So at some point during the night, she'd had an attack, and unfortunately she had the wrong inhaler with her. And so we woke up the next day, and it's the memories are very blurry of that day. I remember being taken to the zoo by the hotel staff, but we were sort of in the room, and my brother was a couple of years older, so he took the lead in ringing down to reception and getting help and so on. But that's what happened.
Yeah, it's very traumatic for all of you. Wow. Okay. And people, just about everyone has some sort of trauma in their life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, overall, I've been incredibly lucky in my life. I have a fantastic supportive family. I have great siblings. And as you say, everybody has something, and it can be little trauma. I was speaking to someone the other week who was sharing their story with me, Sarah Rusbach, and for her she was moving around a lot when she was younger, and so it doesn't have to be some catastrophic life event, but we all have things that happen to us. And those of us that have access to and start using alcohol at a young age are obviously much more vulnerable to having dependence problems later on in life.
And do you think that some people are just have more addictive personalities?
There is some evidence that there is some genetic factors that will increase or decrease your risk. I've actually had my genetic test done, and I don't have any underlying genetic increased risk of alcohol dependence, and I don't have alcohol dependence in the family. But certainly if I look at Clean Slate Clinic clients, more than 50% report some level of substance dependence in the family. So as I said, this isn't just about alcohol. That was my particular problem. But for more than 50% of our clients, there's some family history of substance dependence. So there's absolutely a genetic I don't like to think of it as addictive personality. I know that's sort of the vernacular, but in terms of genetic risk factors, there's some evidence that that's absolutely a consideration.
Interesting. So I was looking at one of your videos, and you were saying that you described yourself as an accidental founder and reluctant CEO. Interesting, because I was also a reluctant CEO because my co-founder just said, you're the CEO. And I said, look, I haven't got any business background. Obviously, you do have quite a bit of background there, but tell us a bit more about that, the accidental founder and reluctant CEO.
No problem. Yeah. So the accidental founder is obviously Chris found me, or
Right.
Chris and Chris, my two other co-founders, found me. My dad ran his own business. I would always had an interest, but I never felt that I was an ideas person. And it certainly wasn't on my radar to set up a startup. It wasn't sort of on my bucket list to do. And I'm pretty, as you can see, a bit old in the tooth, probably, for a startup founder, although I hear
Not
that there's...
really. Like, that's a bit of a
No?
myth these days. A lot more older people, like I'm a lot older than you, that are starting, startups.
I had heard that, but in your mind's eye, you sort of have the Silicon Valley 20-year-old as your typical startup character. So, but in any case, it's not something that I had really thought was something I was going to do. I was interested in running my own business, and indeed, whilst we were setting up Clean Slate Clinic, and it was a hobby, I ran my own consulting business quite successfully for a little while in parallel. Okay. But I'd never, as I said, never really thought, okay, I'm going to get into the startup world and I'm going to raise investment and I'm going to do all this stuff. Right. I didn't, the social enterprise was a bit by accident as well, because Chris Rain had previously set up a not-for-profit. I'd come from both the public sector and the for-profit sector. And we had a lot of debate early on about, should we be a not-for-profit? What should we be? And, the social enterprise felt like a really good option. And it comes with, we can talk about this, but it comes with so many challenges, but that struck the right balance between, our heart as a group of social justice oriented individuals who want to make social impact, but with the agility and flexibility to grow, particularly at those early days. The idea of having to set up all the governance that you need around a not-for-profit just felt like a lot of work for not much impact. So that was actually accidental. And then I guess the reluctant CEO bit was a little bit similar. My two co-founders were like, oh, you can be CEO. And I sort of agreed to the title without really thinking about it. And then the Clean Slate sort of took off and started snowballing. And one of us had to step up and step in and say, we're gonna commit full time to this, because otherwise it's either gonna fall over, because suddenly it grew a life of its own. And one thing I had always said is that I don't want to be a CEO. So when I was in the public sector early on, I'd been looking up, thinking, where do I want to end up? And I was like, okay, director of strategy, director of operations. That's probably on the strategy side, and that fit because I like developing new ideas, developing growth strategy, etc. But what I didn't like about the CEO was the external facing side. And I hate being on social media. I hate posting on LinkedIn. I hate doing this kind of stuff, although it's getting more familiar and more fun, I have to say. But the idea of putting yourself out there and being the face of something was not ever on my again on my bucket list. Indeed, it was something that I would shy away from. I'd much rather be in a darkened room thinking and coming up with ideas and plans and executing on them.
Yeah, it's amazing how you can adapt. Yeah. I remember when I used to do some video work in a large training organization, and I was filming all these teachers, and everybody's like super nervous to get in front of the camera, and I was pretty much the same as well. But then after a while, just doing it over and over, then you just start relaxing into it more. I think a lot of things are like that. It's just the practice of doing it, and now I actually enjoy. I enjoy doing the podcast and talking to people. It's more the conversation, But it's interesting. And so you're saying, at one stage you took off, but this podcast we also talk about failures and the wisdom and what we learned from that. So can you tell us before everything took off, what issues you came across and how you got through those and what you learned from that?
Absolutely. And just to say, it took off, but that doesn't mean that we're past the precipice of success and failure. I feel like I'm constantly at the edge of the precipice with success on one side and failure on the other. And I don't know quite which way I'm going to fall. So, right. A year from now, it might be all be over. We're not through. We're in scale up mode, but failure is still just around the corner as a potential for me. So I wouldn't say we're out of the woods.
When you start up, really, that's it. You're always living on the edge, so to speak.
Exactly. Yes, so many failures and lessons learned. I think probably one of the most interesting parts of the journey for me was the capital raising side. And we had so many false starts with that before we're closing our round this month, and we will have been successful. But that was an incredibly, the barriers that I would say, if you want to make life as hard for yourself as possible, I would recommend be a female founder in the healthcare space, trying to do something in addiction, because female founders, as we know, get 3% of venture capital funding, and generally underrepresented in terms of funding and investment. Healthcare, incredibly challenging from a regulatory perspective. So you have to have the evidence base behind what you're doing. There's a lot of compliance you need to meet. You've got APRA regulations, you've got Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare Standards, and a range of other accreditations that you need to be mindful of. You need really strong clinical governance in place, and that's a lot of work. And then addiction is probably the least glamorous area of healthcare that you could go into. I heard a fascinating anecdote from the chief executive of Smart Recovery, who was telling me Dry July. So Dry July raises funds for cancer, typically. So people stop drinking for July, and then the money goes to cancer. And one year they attempted to change it so that the money from Dry July went to addiction, and they got less than 10% of the funds that they would normally raise for cancer. So that just gives you a sense of, because addiction is still highly stigmatized. We've come leaps and bounds in mental health more broadly. So people recognize that mental health is a legitimate problem and it's not your fault if you have anxiety and depression. We've got a long way to go on addiction. So I'd say those three factors probably made life quite challenging. So my attempts to get funding support failed. Most of them failed.
So step us through that and the lessons you learned that you could pass on to another founder in that area as well, with a similar difficulty.
Thing. So I watched another founder who's, to be fair, is also female and in healthcare. This was back about 18 months ago, decide that she was going to raise funding. 2.5 months later, she'd raised $3 million, including a significant proportion from Blackbird. And I watched her and went, okay, so in 2.5 months from now, I'll have $3 million for Clean Slate. That's how it works. Possibly my expectations were a little bit unrealistic. I mean, she did an amazing job. So I set off and she very kindly connected me with some of the VCs that she'd been speaking to. I found my ways to connect into others. Top tip, if you're speaking to VCs, a warm introduction is 10 times better than reaching out cold. Reaching out cold had a very, very, very low success rate for me, but actually getting a conversation with a warm introduction is much easier. Very happy to pay it forward with the networks that I built for any startups that are out there looking to speak to VCs. But I had lots and lots and lots of conversations with VCs and burnt a huge amount of time in doing that. And they were all very lovely. But fundamentally, they probably weren't quite honest enough with me, which is they probably should have said up front, this is not a VC backable business based on the financial plan that you're putting forward. And I did my very female thing of putting forward a risk-adjusted, realistic financial plan, not here's what a hockey stick looks like, I reckon we can get there. And I would say that's probably a distinction between, I'm going to generalize now. There are lots of male founders out there that sell the dream. I was trying to sell the reality. If you want VC funding, that's probably a mistake because they're going to risk adjust everything down anyway. So don't do it for them because you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. So that was one issue. The fact that we're a social enterprise, I think there's a bit of tension between traditional VC and a social enterprise model because fundamentally we're purpose before profit, and that's built into our objects. VCs are very focused on this 10x return, but also billion-dollar business.
And obviously, I interviewed as well. He said that they're also worried about sustainability as well.
Sustainability and scalability, and that was probably the other big thing is because we're not a widget, we're not an app, we're not something that you can put on the marketplace and it will scale itself. We have services attached to our technology, so we're technology-enabled health. We're health tech, or we're technology-enabled healthcare, or we're healthcare with amazing supporting tech. Depends how you want to frame it. But we absolutely have services as part of our business. Now, I personally believe that is the only way to really create value from a health utility, health impact point of view. There's not too much that technology alone can do. You're going to need a doctor or a nurse somewhere along the line. But scalability was a huge question mark as well. So those combination of factors meant probably if I'd really understood VCs and maybe listened to more podcasts like this and done a bit more due diligence before I started the process, it's not the cohort I would have started talking to. So my attempts to get VC funding absolutely failed because I just didn't understand enough about it.
And so where did you get the funding from? So what did you do?
So I went to the Impact Investment Summit this time last year. I'm back there next week to talk about my journey and started looking for true impact investors. So those that are looking for a social and financial return on investment and we offer a great financial return compared to putting your money in the bank or anything like that. But it's not 10x in 2 years. It's probably 10x in 3 or 4 years. But there's also a clear social return, and the landscape is changing. But even there at the Impact Investment Summit, there was only a very small number of impact investors that genuinely put a value on the social return. That actually said, if you're bringing me a financial return and a social return, we will value that social return when we're considering the investment. But I got some leads from there, and ultimately the leads, Snow Foundation, I have to just pause and say they without Snow Foundation, there would be no Clean Slate Clinic. They've been backing us from the start. I'm a Snow entrepreneur. They've given us grant funding, and they are our lead investor as well. But also the Impact Investment Summit then identified some more leads for genuine impact investors. Still, even the impact investors were like, show me you can scale. And I couldn't because I needed investment to scale and we were bootstrapped. Snow Foundation gave me a grant last year purely to prove out the growth hypothesis. And they said, okay, take this grant funding, spend it as if it was an investment in growth, and let's see what it does. And we 4x'd within a month.
Wow.
So that growth grant, and I'll be talking about catalytic capital next week, that growth grant then then I could go to other impact investors and indeed other slightly more traditional investors and say, here's the trajectory, because we're actually on it. And that all of a sudden, the door started opening and people got interested. But I had to prove the growth before people would invest in the growth. And maybe it's because we were a services business. Drawing the line and the trajectory theoretically was not enough. And I think, again, lessons learned. We were at a really funny stage in our journey because we'd proven product market fit. We were in market, but we were bootstrapped. And I think that's a very difficult place to be if you're looking for growth funding, if you're not able to demonstrate growth already. So it was a challenging place to be in, and it really was that growth grant that sort of unlocked everything for us.
I was in a very similar position. We were bootstrapped as well. And so it was similar. So that's interesting. So what would then the advice be? Like, first of all, if you're in the social enterprise area, if you start up there, go to the social investment summit, the impact investment summit, or look specifically for impact investors. I mean, aside from that summit, are there other groups?
Absolutely. So there's SECNA, which is the Social Enterprise Council of New South Wales in the ACT. Become a member of that. And what I've found is it's an incredibly supportive network in that other social enterprises will help you if they've been through a similar journey. So build your networks of similar organizations and reach out to them and say, how did you do it? Have you got anyone you would recommend that I speak to? I've had so much generosity from Social Enterprise Australia, Social Ventures Australia, Red Hat Impact, other organizations who've gone out of their way to just help me and connect me with people. As I say, Snow Foundation, I'll mention them again, have just been incredible for us and also helped to connect me with other networks that they know. Just reach out to some of those organizations and to other social enterprises. It's a very collaborative and supportive community.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I've interviewed Cameron Neal from Red Hat Impact. So
he helped me hugely. He loved what we were doing, and just connected me with people.
Yeah. He's a one lovely guy and doing great work as well.
Absolutely.
And I also interviewed some of the people that he's helped as well, like Jody Rich from Emotions.
They're doing great work.
Yeah. Another female founder that is doing really, really well. And she has a really solid sort of financial background as well. Awesome. Well, I think that's really good advice. So before you just do anything, just make sure you're in the right space and targeting the right investors, and just don't take any investors either. They have to be a good fit for you, because I know it's like you sort of maybe desperate for money sometimes to make it grow, or your runway's running out or whatever, but you still need to get the right people involved, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And to that point, Paul, I'd say, therefore, start really early on. So even if you're not thinking about investment, start conversations with potential investors, get your network ready so that at the point that you are ready, you know who's interested. You've got an engaged network of prospective investors who are interested in what you're doing. Putting an advisory board together was incredibly helpful for me, but it doesn't have to be formal or informal structures of senior connected people who are passionate about what you're doing and about the impact that you're trying to make, who can open doors and make connections for you as well. And I think the other thing I would say as a lesson learned is, as I said, that growth grant, I wish I could say strategically I've thought about and thought we need a growth grant to prove that we can scale. I hadn't, but thinking about that early on, I wish I had. So I wish I'd thought, actually, what I really need to ask for is some funding to prove out the growth. And that might be a different set of funders who are going to give you especially if you're a social enterprise, who are going to give you a grant to prove a hypothesis. But think about that early on as well.
Yeah, someone like Red Hat could do that. So interesting. That's really good advice. So I'm sure there'll be some entrepreneurs listening in the same space that that'll help them not to go down the wrong path and waste so much time. And even personally, like, I really didn't like the idea of going after investors. So I'm like, always, no, we're self-funded and we're just trying to get sales. And then if I get sales, why do I need investors? But I think if I did go after some investment money, particularly on the sales and marketing side, which we lacked, then it would have made a difference.
Yeah, when we were making the decision about should we go for investment or not, we were looking at, we've got a first mover advantage. We are the only national virtual care addiction treatment provider in Australia. We had built a really solid technology platform that had taken us 3 years and a whole load of proprietary code that sits behind it. And I felt we were at risk because we were so small. We could have potentially grown incrementally over the next 10 years. But by the time we did, we would have been swallowed up by somebody else who'd come over and come in and taken over. Yeah. So I felt that we needed to accelerate our growth to secure our market position and therefore our future and our sustainability.
And that's really interesting because also a similar thing happened with us. So we were doing 360 VR, like experiences, so somebody could be on the job and make decisions and see the consequences. And this was 2017, and VR was really, really new, and we were pretty early as well. But we thought, no, we want to bootstrap, and then the development side took ages, like 4 years, and a hell of a lot of money. And then there were some other companies that came up, say around probably 2021, doing something similar, because we were actually the first doing that in Australia. And then they just had a whole lot of business development guys, sales guys, marketing, and they just went really big and really quick, in 2 years, and just completely went past us. Yeah. And so, in hindsight, I should have looked at getting some investors' money, but others no. Like I know I've got a good friend. He has an HR platform, and he's bootstrapping as well. And no one's sort of overtaking what he's doing. And if you can bootstrap, if it works, I think it's always best. But like that time factor thing, if there's others that are up and coming, they're going to surpass you. You do need an investment money.
That's it. It's a very personalized and business specific choice. But I think those are exactly some of the if you think about weighing up the pros and cons, the pros of the investment are it gives you the opportunity to compete and to stay at the cutting edge for exactly the reasons you described. Like if you're at the cutting edge, then you should probably start looking behind you, because you can guarantee you're not going to be there alone for long. Yeah. And so that sort of, is it important from a defensive play point of view? On the other hand, as you say, bootstrapping, if you can, gives you full control, less board papers to write, less governance to deal. There's a whole load of work that comes with investment, investor reporting monthly. Every month seems to fly by, and then it's time for an investor report again. So there's downsides to it as well. And then others that are interested and want to say in what you're doing in your business, and if you've been used to making all of the decisions, that doesn't always feel comfortable.
No, and you have to sort that out as well. Like there's positions on the board and all that sort of stuff. You don't want, your, say, 2 co-founders. I think I've heard of a case where there's 2 co-founders and 2 investors, and it's the board, but one of the co-founders is the CEO, and then they sack the CEO, and then they're not on the board anymore either, and they lose the say in everything. Control. Yeah. So you've got to be really careful with that sort of stuff. And again,
this will change if we raise funds again, but we've certainly been very careful at this round to make sure that we retain the controlling interest, we retain the controlling rights on the board. So those sorts of things, especially for your first round investment, you don't want to lose that control too quickly.
No, absolutely. All right. Well, talking about addiction and stigma, I think there's some cultural communities that have more stigma than others. Have you found that?
Absolutely. So there are we do quite a bit of work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owned health organisations in supporting them, and we have a number of Aboriginal clients who've come through the program, and they have, I think there's a level of stigma attached to them culturally, which is really unfair. So the harms from alcohol and other drugs are disproportionately large in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but the prevalence of addiction isn't particularly higher, and that is a misnomer. So people don't understand that, and they think there's a higher prevalence amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and that creates stigma. So I think for that community, reaching out is very difficult. I was speaking to one of our Aboriginal clients for feedback not long ago, and they weren't comfortable. We run smart recovery groups online, and they didn't feel comfortable turning their video on in that environment because they were concerned about being stigmatized as an Aboriginal woman in this case. So I think they have additional barriers to access and stigma-related barriers that we have to work extra hard to support and address. And it's the statistics are shocking in terms of the harm, but it also relates to the overlap with rural and regional Australia, where again, the burden of harm is significantly higher, but not necessarily the prevalence. So it just means that there is better, easier access to treatment in metro areas, and there's not enough good access to treatment in rural and regional areas. And obviously that's one of the things we're trying to address. The LGBTQI plus community, again, also, they already face significant stigma in reaching out to traditional healthcare service providers. I was talking to Andrew Addy recently, who went through the face-to-face Clean Slate program, about some of his experiences in really stigma creating care by healthcare professionals. So he shared this story publicly, so he doesn't mind me telling it, but he was taking PrEP, and there was a community nurse who misunderstood that and meant that he had HIV, and spoke to him in a car park and said, "Oh, I see you've got HIV," which was factually incorrect and highly stigmatizing. And so they're already facing that kind of stigma in routine care. That creates, addiction already has its own stigma around it, and again, there's inaccurate perceptions around that community, which create barriers for accessing care as well. So we're very proud that we're actually LGBTQI plus led in our medical director, and provide what the community have described to us as queer affirming care. And I think that's really important for the LGBTQI plus community.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, so you treat alcohol, and then you do stimulants. When you say stimulants, like that's drugs, right? Like what categories?
Ice, cocaine as the main ones, yeah.
But not, I would say, not heroin.
We're not doing opioids yet, so we're looking to implement an opioid pathway later this year. I think so. What our service provides is fully home-based, integrated and comprehensive assessment, withdrawal and recovery. And it's a 12-month program done at home under the supervision of addiction medicine specialists, GPs with enhanced training, and alcohol and other drug experienced nurses. And it's an alternative to inpatient rehab and withdrawal. I think what's different is we provide all of the components of care, so you don't have to go to a different nurse or clinic for your assessment versus your withdrawal versus your recovery. It's all done together. And that works really well for alcohol, stimulants, cannabis, where you have a defined period of withdrawal. So alcohol, it actually takes about a week to physically withdraw from alcohol, much longer to deal with why did you drink in the first place and the cravings and all those sorts of things that come with the actual physical withdrawal is about a week. For stimulants and cannabis, you sort of have an acute withdrawal period that's about a week as well, and then a subacute withdrawal period of another 2 to 3 weeks or so, where that's a really difficult period for you as you adjust physically and sort of deal with most acute withdrawal symptoms. For something like opioids or benzodiazepines, the other sort of drugs of concern, that withdrawal time frame doesn't work. You're talking about a much longer period of gradually decreasing maintenance therapy. So it's a different model of care.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's not absolutely needed. And in the case of opioids, I would say urgently needed, because a lot of the private prescribing clinics have closed as the PBS rules and remuneration have changed last year. So we need to do something, but the model of care will look a bit different. So we're just working through exactly how we would deliver really good quality evidence-based care that complies with all of the national guidelines, but it will be different than our current model for alcohol, stimulants and cannabis.
Yeah. And it's really important that when somebody, realizes, okay, there's something wrong, that it's them making the decision to actually go through the process. And I really I had a look at your website, and your program is extremely affordable. And I know from experience with other family members, some of the private clinics are, like maximum, I think 27 days or 30 days, which is not enough, because then, okay, you detox, you're out, see you later. And your program follows up for the whole year.
That's right.
And extremely affordable. You can even do it in payments, like anybody pretty much could afford that, which I think I congratulate you on, because that's what's needed. There shouldn't be barriers to help these people, because it's like an illness. It's like we talk about mental illness. Addiction is like an illness as well, and they just need help.
Absolutely. And you kind of have, outside of our program, I would say you have the two extremes. So you have public services that are, wonderful and full of just wonderful clinicians who are trying to do the best that they can, but wildly underfunded.
Yeah.
The Rethink Addiction report from 2022 estimated a shortfall in treatment places every year in Australia of 500,000. And so you're talking about waiting lists of 6 months' time, having to try and find different ways to get in, you coming through the emergency department because that's the only way you can get into a bed. So real challenges in access, and also huge stigma as well. People don't want to, particularly like if I think about me in the situation I was in, high functioning, didn't identify with my completely wrong stereotype of an alcoholic being someone with a brown paper bag on a park bench, but feeling like going to a public clinic, that's sort of the cohort that I would be with. So overworked, underfunded, and poor access. And then at the other end of the spectrum, as you say, very high cost, sometimes $100,000 for a 30-day stay. And in issues around the regulation of private alcohol and other drug facilities, some fantastic, some questionable in the evidence base that they're using for their approaches, but completely out of reach for most Australians with the average wage of an Australian. And for both of those, your relapse rate within a few weeks is higher than 50%. For the reasons you've articulated. You're there for a short period of time. You then go back to your old triggers, your old networks, having done very little work to prepare for what that's going to look like and have a plan. Yeah. And then what we're trying to provide is something that is accessible, as you say, for everybody. So we try to make it cheaper than the cost of drinking or the cost of taking stimulants or the cost of smoking cannabis, and allow people to pay over the 12-month period. We stay with people for the long term, and we withdraw people in situ. So we do the work before detox to put a plan in place around how we're going to manage triggers, etc., during that time. And that works really well. And our relapse rate at 1 month, which has been independently verified, is 2%. That's the kind of difference that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic work that you're doing, so needed. And to get into the public ones, like first they need to go to a detox, for example. And then just to get into that, it might be 2 or 3 months wait. Then they get out of detox. They're ready to go into rehab. And maybe in 6 months, like, that just doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
People need it immediately in that moment when they decide, oh, this is what I want to do.
Exactly. That's it. You need to reduce all those barriers so that at a point that someone's ready for help, say, great, I've got an appointment for you on Monday. And that you can catch people in that moment and change lives.
What are your thoughts on the so-called war on drugs that have been going on, like in America since the 80s and here? And what are your thoughts on that? Because I got some pretty strong opinions on that. But
I mean, my thoughts are informed by the evidence, which is absolutely crystal clear that it doesn't work. It's caused more harm than anything else. And we need a fundamental shift in policy. And every time the government brings experts, true experts in to advise, they all say the same thing, which is the war on drugs doesn't work. It's a poor policy position. We actually need to decriminalize. We need to support people. We need to recognize addiction for what it is, which is a condition that is not the individual's fault, and they need support and help. And to criminalize and penalize and punish does not work. That's my thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, what the police need when they go out to these situations is trained counselors and psychologists and people that treat people with drugs. That's what they need to handle those situations, instead of treating them as criminals, and it just makes everything worse. And then also 100%. You've got all the drug dealers making the money and all the addicts committing all these crimes and people affected by those crimes, and then it just doesn't work at all. It's just
100%.
Yeah, I know there was in Portugal, they had a big problem with heroin, and so they changed everything there. They said, okay, we're going to put all the money that we had on policing into helping and supporting the addict. So similar to what you're doing, getting them, that help and support, and then long-term support, even that money going into getting them, accommodation and long-term accommodation, back into work or their own business, all of that. And then after 10 years, only 30% there was only down 70% less heroin addicts than 10 years before.
I spend a lot of time in Portugal because my husband is Portuguese, and I have spoken to the drug policy leads in Portugal, and it is without doubt one of the most progressive countries in the world in its drug policy. It's also probably one of the only countries where genuinely they don't need Clean Slate Clinic. Because of those changes that they made decades ago, if you have an addiction issue in Portugal, you can access treatment straight away. They don't need us.
Yeah. It would save so many lives and so much money.
100%.
But politicians, they just go with populist views. That's why, what you're doing is good as well. Hopefully also, the work to change people's views about the stigma, of being an addict, or that addicts, a lot of addicts, they actually have mental illnesses. So, for example, I'll give you a statistic that I know of. People with borderline personality disorder, which is a mental illness, 90% are addicts because they self-medicate. Yeah.
Here's a couple of others for you. 80% of our clients have a co-occurring mental health condition, most commonly anxiety, depression, ADHD, PTSD. And I was talking to Faye Lawrence a couple of weeks ago around the relationship between ADHD and substance use disorder. And the most recent meta-analysis on that says that almost 50% of individuals with ADHD have co-occurring substance use disorder for exactly the same reason. They're trying to quiet the noise in their head, self-medicate.
Yeah. And I also think, what are the effects of so much Ritalin being prescribed in the past? I don't know if it still is these days, but that's a pretty strong drug to give to kids. Like, I'm sure there must be better treatment than that. And that, I've heard that some of that can lead to people, being addicts later in life as well. Like, it makes sort of common sense to me.
I think it's a really, really challenging area, and a really important area for more research, but also I'd say particularly for adults who are struggling with substance use disorder, having a look and because typically that would be undiagnosed adult ADHD. If they find they're using alcohol to quiet their mind down, reduce the sort of activity in their mind, it's worth having a think about. There's a very simple ADHD screening, self-screening test that you can do. Just having a look to say, actually, have I got an issue here? Because that would really help.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, on a lighter note, can we talk about your career in 1997 to 1999?
Well,
in Guernsey.
Oh, as a pianist.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, don't set any expectations for anybody to listen to me play the piano. Now, you've got to bear in mind that Guernsey is a very small island. So just because I played the piano for a career in Guernsey, I wouldn't say that that makes me any sort of highly accomplished pianist. So that would be my caveat there.
Okay, well, I was going to say, have you got a piano nearby? You could play a bit for us.
I don't, because I'm at my co-founder's apartment today, but I do have a piano at home, and it is, I know that my life is in balance, and things are going well when I have the time, at least 3 or 4 times a week, to sit down at the piano. And that's, I don't need alcohol to self-medicate these days, but the piano is part of my self-medication for sure.
Yeah, and all those sort of things can help maintain our mental health as well. And what other things do you do besides playing the piano to, being a startup founder and CEO particularly is really stressful. So what do you do to cope with that and to, make sure that your mental health stays great?
Yeah. And I would say I'm not the end products, but I'm sure that's true for many. I'm still working on that because it's you get very passionate about what you're trying to achieve, and sometimes that affects your boundaries. So I am a work in progress in terms of setting boundaries. But the foundational things are sleep, getting good night's sleep is critical, eating well, and movement. So getting out there. I have 2 Portuguese water dogs. They are the loves of my life, next to or parallel to my husband, I would say. And getting out and taking their gorgeous fluffy selves for a hike every day is great for the soul, but also my mental health.
Totally agree with you. I've got my little dog sitting next to me there at the moment.
They are the best friends in the world.
Yeah, great company and great stress relievers as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, so to finish off, what is a question that no one has ever asked you that you wish they would have?
What's a question that no one's ever asked me that I wish they would have? Well, I'm a bit of an introvert, so the less questions people ask me, the better.
Well, I could reframe it. Something about you that nobody knows that is unusual, interesting.
Well, you've revealed my piano playing history, but maybe the other slightly obscure thing that nobody knows about me is that I have my windsurfing license.
Licensed? You've licensed windsurfing?
You did back in the day when I got it, which is about 25 years ago.
And so do you still go windsurfing?
I haven't been for a little while, but I have plans and aspirations to do that. So I do really enjoy windsurfing. Say anything on the water, I enjoy. But yeah, I need to get back into windsurfing. So that's on my check back in with me in a year. If I haven't achieved that, then something's gone awry.
Okay, we'll do it. And I will ask you one more question as well. So if there was only one piece of advice you could give to an early stage startup founder, and in your case, in the social enterprise space, just one, what would that be?
Surround yourself with advisors and supporters who can help you, whether they're people that have been there before, been there, done it, or people that have connections that you're looking for. Find the people that are going to help you. Don't try to do it alone. You really need that network of support, and don't be afraid to reach out cold to people. You would be amazed. Most people want to help. So reach out, build that network of supporters that are going to help you along the way.
Yeah, I think that's so true and so important as well. And usually if you ask for help, people do like to help.
Yeah.
And that's the key to it, You don't have to pretend to be something, and just being yourself, being authentic, wouldn't you say? And
100%.
then people will usually try and help. Like if I reach out to get a guest on the podcast and, I'm authentic, then they come on, like in your case. So, look, really, really admire the very, very important work you're doing, and I wish you every success in every way. It's really important. I hope people support you all the way because it's so needed. addiction affects so many lives, not just the people that are addicted, their families,
Absolutely.
community, everything. So wonderful work that you're doing. I really admire it, and I'm a big supporter now, a big fan. And hopefully more people will have a bit more of understanding about what you're doing, and also support the great work that you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Thea.
so much, Paul. Thanks for having me on.